It's 11:10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in April 1999, and spring has finally arrived in Littleton, Colorado, where students at Columbine High School are doing what teenagers do best: complaining about homework, planning for prom, maybe sneaking an extra few minutes of freedom before their next class, with some lucky enough to eat lunch outside on the grass, laughing and chatting in the warm sunshine, completely oblivious to the fact that in exactly 7 minutes, everything was supposed to change forever, because hidden in the cafeteria below them, two 20-pound propane bombs were ticking toward 11:17 a.m., the moment when 500 students packed into the lunchroom were supposed to die in a massive explosion that would have made Columbine the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil at that time. But as the clock strikes 11:17 and then 11:18, nothing happens. The bombs Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold spent over a year planning and building have failed to detonate, leaving two frustrated teenagers sitting in a parking lot watching their master plan crumble. Which is why at 11:19 a.m., emergency dispatchers start receiving frantic calls about shots fired at the school. Because what happened next wasn't supposed to be Plan A at all. Harris and Klebold, those two seemingly ordinary seniors whose yearbook photos show them looking like any other high school kids, had envisioned themselves as architects of mass destruction, not school shooters. But when their bombs failed, they improvised, walking onto school grounds with guns and beginning an assault that would last less than an hour but change the trajectory of American education, childhood, and safety forever, targeting students eating lunch outside, then moving through hallways and eventually into the library where 52 people hid under tables in terror, not knowing that this improvised attack was creating a blueprint that would inspire copycat killers for decades to come. And by the time it was over, 13 people, not numbers, but real human beings with dreams and plans and families waiting at home, would never walk through their front doors again, including Dave Sanders, the teacher who died trying to save his students, and teenagers like Rachel Scott who loved photography, Cassie Bernal who wanted to become a nurse, and Matthew Kechter who was saving money for his first car. Each of them starting that morning worried about typical teenage concerns and never making it to their next class. While outside the school, parents gathered in panic at a nearby elementary school, desperately clutching their phones and waiting for news that would either bring relief or shatter their worlds completely, not knowing that this single day would transform every school in America, leading to metal detectors and armed guards and lockdown drills that would become as routine as fire safety, stealing the innocence from millions of children who would grow up practicing how to hide from killers in their classrooms. Because Harris and Klebold didn't just attack Columbine High School on April 20th, 1999, they attacked the very idea that schools were safe spaces, that childhood was protected, that something like this couldn't happen in suburban America. And perhaps most tragically, they got exactly what they wanted in the end. Becoming infamous, their methods studied and copied, their names remembered long after their victims' names faded from headlines. Which is why this isn't just the story of what happened on that terrible Tuesday morning. This is the story of how one day changed America forever. And more importantly, this is the story they got wrong from the very beginning. Welcome back to Unchanged. I am Greg, and what you just heard challenges everything you think you know about Columbine. If you're new here, we dive deep into true crime cases with respect for victims and an unwavering commitment to facts over sensationalism. Because when it comes to cases like this, the truth matters more than the narrative that sells newspapers. Hit that subscribe button, because today we are going to completely reframe one of the most misunderstood tragedies in American history: Littleton, Colorado, population 40,000. The kind of place where people move to raise their families. where the biggest concerns are property taxes and whether the high school football team will make playoffs. Columbine High School sits in this idyllic setting like a fortress of American suburbia. Red brick buildings, well-maintained grounds. Home to 1,900 students who represent everything we want to believe about safe, small-town America. On April 20th, 1999, it was supposed to be just another Tuesday, with students shuffling between classes, teachers preparing for the final stretch before summer break, and parents across town going about their normal routines, completely unaware that their community was about to become synonymous with tragedy. But here's where the story you know begins to fall apart. Because Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold weren't planning a shooting that day, they were planning a bombing that would have killed more people than the Oklahoma City attack 4 years earlier. Those 2 propane bombs hidden in the cafeteria weren't backup plans or afterthoughts. They were the entire point, designed to collapse the library above and create casualties that would dwarf every act of domestic terrorism in American history. The shooting only happened because their bombs failed, which means everything that followed was improvisation. 2 teenagers making up a massacre as they went along, creating chaos that would ripple through generations. By 12:08 p.m., when Harris and Klebold turned their guns on themselves, 13 innocent people had lost their lives, and 21 others bore physical wounds that would heal far faster than the psychological scars. But those numbers tell only part of the story. Because the real victim count extends far beyond Columbine's hallways, it includes every student who has lived through a lockdown drill, every teacher who has wondered if today might be the day, every parent who has felt that spike of panic when their child's school calls unexpectedly, and every community that has had to confront the reality that this could happen anywhere, anytime, to anyone. The media got almost everything wrong from day one, painting Harris and Klebold as bullied outcasts seeking revenge against jocks and popular kids, members of something called the Trenchcoat Mafia, goths who listened to dark music and played violent video games until they snapped. It's a neat narrative that makes sense to people desperately searching for simple explanations to incomprehensible acts, but it's also complete fiction. And that fiction has shaped too. Decades of misguided prevention efforts and copycat attacks by people who think they're following the Columbine playbook when they're really chasing myths. The truth is far more disturbing than the myth, because the truth reveals that this could have been prevented, that warning signs were ignored, and that the very way we remember Columbine has contributed to making it happen again and again. So let's start from the beginning, not with what the newspapers told you, but with who Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold really were, and why understanding that difference might be the key to making sure no other community has to endure what Littleton experienced on that April morning. Let's start with the first and most dangerous lie that's been told about Columbine for 25 years. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were not the bullied outcasts seeking revenge that the media painted them to be. This myth didn't just misrepresent what happened. It fundamentally changed how we approach school violence prevention, and it's gotten people killed. So before we can understand what really happened on April 20th, we need to understand who these 2 teenagers actually were, not the caricatures they became in newspaper headlines and TV documentaries. Eric David Harris, born April 9th, 1981, in Wichita, Kansas, was the son of Wayne and Kathy Harris. His father was an Air Force transport pilot, which meant the family moved frequently during Eric's childhood: Kansas, Ohio, Michigan, and finally Colorado in 1993 when Eric was 12 years old. This constant relocation is often cited as a potential factor in Eric's development. But the truth is more complex and more disturbing than simple childhood instability. By all external appearances, Eric Harris was succeeding in high school. He maintained decent grades, played on the soccer team, had a circle of friends, and even held down a job at a local pizza place. Teachers describe him as articulate and intelligent, sometimes a bit arrogant, but nothing that raised serious red flags. His parents saw a typical teenager who occasionally got into minor trouble but seemed to be on track for college and a normal adult life. What they didn't see, what nobody saw until it was too late, was that Eric Harris was developing into what forensic psychiatrists would later classify as a textbook psychopath. Behind closed doors, Harris was living a completely different life. In the basement of his family's home on South Reed Street, he spent hours writing in journals that revealed a mind consumed with hatred, superiority, and violent fantasies. These weren't the angry rantings of a bullied kid seeking revenge. They were the calculated thoughts of someone who genuinely believed he was superior to everyone around him and fantasized about proving it through mass murder. He wrote about wanting to kill inferior people, about his disgust with humanity in general, and about his desire to commit an act so spectacular that it would ensure his place in history. Harris was also deeply involved in the early internet culture of the late 1990s, maintaining websites where he posted violent stories, instructions for making explosives, and rants against society. He created elaborate levels for the video game Doom, many of which featured school-like environments where players could practice shooting students and teachers. But here's the crucial point that investigators missed for years. This wasn't a teenager acting out because he felt powerless or victimized. This was someone who felt powerful and wanted to exercise that power in the most extreme way possible. Dylan Bennett Klebold was a completely different case. Born September 11, 1981, in Lakewood, Colorado, Dylan was the son of Tom and Sue Klebold. Tom was a geophysicist. Sue worked with disabled students. Where Eric had moved frequently, Dylan had lived in the same area his entire life, attending the same schools, maintaining the same friendships. He was 6'4", gangly and awkward, with a shy personality that made him seem younger than his 17 years. Dylan was creative, sensitive, and suffered from what we would now recognize as clinical depression. His school assignments revealed a young man grappling with existential questions, romantic rejection, and a deep sense of not belonging in the world around him. He wrote poetry about love and death, created stories about dark themes, and seemed to be searching for meaning in a life that felt empty to him. Teachers and classmates describe him as quiet, sometimes withdrawn, but generally well-liked when he did engage with others. Unlike Harris, Dylan Klebold had a relatively stable home life. His parents were involved and caring. His older brother Byron was successful and served as a positive role model, and the family regularly participated in community activities. Dylan collected baseball cards, loved the Boston Red Sox, and had dreams of attending college, possibly studying creative writing or film. In many ways, he was exactly the kind of teenager that Columbine High School was designed to serve: middle class, college-bound, with involved parents and a supportive community. So how did these two very different teenagers end up planning the deadliest school attack in American history? The answer lies not in bullying or social rejection, but in a toxic friendship that fed Eric Harris's psychopathy while exploiting Dylan Klebold's depression and need for acceptance. Harris and Klebold met during their freshman year at Columbine, initially bonding over shared interests in computer programming and a mutual disdain for what they saw as the shallow social hierarchies of high school. But their relationship quickly evolved into something far more dangerous. Harris became the dominant personality, the leader with grand visions of violence and infamy, while Klebold became the loyal follower, desperate to maintain his only real friendship and increasingly willing to go along with whatever Eric suggested. By their junior year, Harris was already writing about wanting to commit mass murder, and he was beginning to share these fantasies with Dylan. What started as dark jokes and tough guy posturing gradually escalated into serious planning sessions where Harris would sketch out scenarios for attacking their school. Klebold, isolated and depressed, found in Harris's violent fantasies an outlet for his own feelings of rage and hopelessness, but more importantly, he found acceptance from the one person whose approval he desperately craved. The planning began in earnest during their senior year, roughly 13 months before the attack. Harris, who had been researching explosives and weapons online for months, convinced Klebold that they could make a statement that would shock the world and ensure their names lived on forever. They started small, experimenting with pipe bombs in remote areas outside Littleton, gradually working their way up to more sophisticated devices. Here's where we need to address another persistent myth about Columbine. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision by angry teenagers who finally snapped. The attack required months of careful planning, research, and preparation. Harris and Klebold had to learn how to build bombs, acquire weapons, scout their target, develop detailed timelines, and create contingency plans. This level of premeditation indicates a completely different type of criminal thinking than the reactive violence typically associated with bullying or social rejection. The date April 20th wasn't chosen randomly. It was Adolf Hitler's birthday, and Harris, who had developed an obsession with Nazi imagery and philosophy, saw this as symbolically appropriate for their attack. They called their plan NBK, short for Natural Born Killers, after the Oliver Stone film that glorified mass murderers. They made videos explaining their motivations, wrote letters to be found after their deaths, and even recorded a basement tape where they said goodbye to their parents and explained why they were about to become the most famous teenagers in America. Their original plan was breathtakingly ambitious in its scope and sophistication. Harris and Klebold intended to plant 2 large propane bombs in the school cafeteria, timed to explode during the busiest lunch period when nearly 500 students would be eating. The bombs were designed not just to kill everyone in the cafeteria, but to collapse the library above it, potentially bringing the death toll to over 600 people. They had studied the school's layout, observed traffic patterns during lunch periods, and even calculated the best placement for maximum casualties after the bombs exploded. Harris and Klebold planned to position themselves in the school parking lot where they could shoot survivors as they fled the burning building. They had mapped out sight lines, identified the most likely escape routes, and positioned additional explosive devices to maximize chaos and prevent effective emergency response. If their plan had worked as intended, the Columbine attack would have resulted in more casualties than the Oklahoma City bombing 4 years earlier, but even as they were planning mass murder, both Harris and Klebold continued to maintain their normal lives. Harris worked at his job, went to the prom just 3 days before the attack, and even applied to colleges for the following year. Klebold attended classes, participated in family activities, and showed no obvious signs of being days away from committing one of the worst crimes in American history. This ability to compartmentalize, to plan extreme violence while maintaining normal social facades, is one of the most chilling aspects of the entire case. The myth that Harris and Klebold were bullied outcasts gaining revenge became entrenched in popular culture partly because it offered a simple explanation for incomprehensible acts, and partly because early media reports seized on superficial details without conducting thorough investigations. The trenchcoat mafia became shorthand for the attackers, even though neither Harris nor Klebold were actually members of this loosely affiliated group of students. Reports of jocks bullying goths became accepted fact, even though witnesses and evidence suggested that Harris and Klebold experienced no more bullying than typical for their school, and may have actually been bullies themselves in some instances. The real truth, revealed through years of investigation by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, paints a much more disturbing picture. Harris was identified as a psychopath, someone incapable of empathy, driven by grandiose fantasies of superiority, and excited by the prospect of controlling and ending other people's lives. Klebold was diagnosed as severely depressed and suicidally ideated. Someone so desperate for acceptance and meaning that he was willing to participate in mass murder to maintain his friendship with Harris and achieve the notoriety that Harris promised would make them immortal. Looking back, there were numerous warning signs that were missed or inadequately addressed. Harris had been arrested for breaking into a van and stealing electronics, leading to a court-ordered anger management program that he completed successfully while secretly planning mass murder. Both teenagers had made violent statements in creative writing assignments that concerned some teachers but weren't reported to administrators or parents. Harris's violent website and bomb-making instructions were reported to the sheriff's department, but the report was never fully investigated, perhaps most tragically. Both teenagers were clearly crying out for help in the months leading up to the attack. Dylan's depression was becoming more severe, and he had written in his journal about wanting to die but being afraid to commit suicide alone. Eric's grandiose fantasies were escalating, and his hatred of humanity was becoming more pronounced in his writings and online posts. With proper intervention, mental health counseling, threat assessment, or even just adults taking their concerning behavior seriously, the tragedy might have been prevented entirely. The basement tapes, recorded in the weeks before the attack, reveal the different motivations driving each teenager. Harris speaks confidently about their plans, expressing excitement about the fame they'll achieve and the impact their attack will have on society. He shows no remorse for what they're planning to do, instead expressing anticipation for the violence to come. Klebold, by contrast, seems more conflicted, sometimes appearing excited but other times seeming uncertain or even frightened by what they're planning. The weapons acquisition process took several months and involved multiple illegal purchases. Through a friend who was over 18, they bought 3 firearms at gun shows where background checks weren't required for private sales. A co-worker sold them a 4th weapon directly. They also accumulated hundreds of rounds of ammunition, additional explosive materials, and tactical equipment including knife sets and a sawed-off shotgun. The ease with which 2 teenagers were able to acquire this arsenal remains a contentious point in discussions about gun control and background check legislation. By April 1999, their plan was complete down to the smallest details. They had tested their explosive devices, practiced with their weapons, and even rehearsed their movements through the school. Harris had written detailed instructions for building bombs and posted them online, while Klebold had created maps and timelines for the attack. They had recorded goodbye messages for their families, written manifestos explaining their motivations, and prepared for what they believed would be their transformation from unknown teenagers into infamous killers whose names would be remembered for generations. The final weeks before April 20th were characterized by an odd normalcy that makes the entire case even more disturbing. Both teenagers attended classes, completed assignments, and maintained their social relationships even as they were putting the finishing touches on their plan to murder their classmates and teachers. Harris went to prom on April 17th, just 3 days before the attack, smiling and dancing and giving no indication that he was days away from attempting mass murder. Klebold attended his favorite class and even helped a friend with homework in the days leading up to what he knew would be his final week alive on April 19th. The night before the attack, both teenagers spent time with their families in what appeared to be completely normal evening routines. Harris had dinner with his parents and worked on homework in his room, while Klebold watched television with his family and talked about his plans for after graduation. Neither family had any indication that their sons were less than 12 hours away from committing one of the worst crimes in American history. A fact that continues to haunt both families and raises troubling questions about how well we really know the people closest to us as April 20th dawned clear and bright in Littleton, Colorado. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold woke up knowing it would be their last day alive. They had spent 13 months planning this moment, and now all that remained was execution. But their carefully crafted plan, designed to kill hundreds of people and destroy an entire school, was about to encounter the unpredictability of real life. The bombs they had spent months building and testing were about to fail, forcing them to improvise a massacre that would become the template for school violence for the next quarter century. Tuesday, April 20th, 1999, began like any other school day in the Harris and Klebold households. Wayne and Kathy Harris were getting ready for work, probably reviewing their schedules over coffee and discussing typical parental concerns about their son's upcoming graduation. Across town, Tom and Sue Klebold were likely going through their own morning routines, perhaps reminding Dylan about homework assignments or college application deadlines. Neither family had any idea that their sons had been awake for hours, making final preparations for what they had codenamed Judgment Day. Eric Harris woke up around 5:30 a.m., not because he had to, but because he wanted extra time to prepare mentally for what lay ahead. In his journal, he had written about this moment dozens of times, fantasizing about how it would feel to wake up on the last day of his old life and the first day of his immortality. He dressed carefully, choosing dark clothing that would hide bloodstains and allow for easy movement. He gathered the weapons and explosive devices he had hidden in his bedroom, checking each item against a handwritten list he had prepared weeks earlier. The level of organization Harris demonstrated on the morning of April 20th reveals the calculated nature of what was about to unfold. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of violence. It was a carefully orchestrated operation planned with military precision. Harris had studied mass casualty events, researched law enforcement response times, and even practiced his movements through the school during off hours when the building was empty. He approached this morning with the methodical preparation of a soldier going into battle. Dylan Klebold's morning was markedly different. Friends and family members would later describe him as seeming unusually quiet and withdrawn in his final days, and the morning of April 20th was no exception. Unlike Harris, who approached the day with excitement and anticipation, Klebold appeared conflicted and nervous. He had written in his journal about his fear of pain, his uncertainty about death, and his desperate wish that there was some other way to achieve the acceptance and notoriety he craved. Klebold's final journal entries reveal a young man torn between his loyalty to Eric Harris and his growing awareness of the enormity of what they were planning. He wrote about wanting to back out, about wishing he could find another way to deal with his depression and feelings of alienation. But he also wrote about his fear of disappointing Harris, his terror of being alone again, and his belief that going through with the attack was the only way to prove his worth to the one person whose acceptance he desperately needed. Both families would later describe the morning of April 20th as completely routine. Harris ate breakfast with his parents, discussing plans for the day and showing no signs of the internal preparation he was conducting. Klebold grabbed something quick to eat and engaged in typical teenage conversation about school and weekend plans. These final interactions between parents and sons would haunt both families for years. as they searched desperately for signs they might have missed, words that might have held hidden meaning, or opportunities for intervention that they failed to recognize. Around 7:30 a.m., both teenagers left for school following their normal routines. Harris drove his own car, a Honda Civic that he had packed with additional weapons and explosive devices. Klebold rode with friends, maintaining the casual conversation and normal teenage behavior that had allowed him to hide his intentions for months. Neither gave any indication to family members or classmates that this would be their final morning alive, or that they were carrying weapons capable of killing hundreds of people. Columbine High School on the morning of April 20th was a picture of typical American suburban education. Students were arriving in cars and buses, gathering in small groups to chat before classes began, rushing to finish homework assignments they had procrastinated on the night before. Teachers were setting up their classrooms, reviewing lesson plans, and preparing for another routine day of education. The spring weather was perfect. Clear skies, moderate temperatures. The kind of day that made everyone grateful to be alive and optimistic about the future. The school operated on a standard schedule that Harris and Klebold had memorized and incorporated into their attack plan. First period began at 7:30 a.m., followed by 6 more periods ending at 2:40 p.m. The lunch periods were staggered between 11:10 a.m. and 1:30 p.m., with the peak lunch period running from 11:17 to 11:46 a.m. exactly when Harris and Klebold had timed their bombs to explode. They had calculated that this would maximize casualties while also ensuring that many students would be trapped in the building when the explosions brought down the library ceiling and the cafeteria. Lunch workers were preparing for another busy day of serving nearly 2,000 students. The large, open space with its high ceilings and multiple entry points had been chosen by Harris and Klebold specifically because it offered the greatest potential for mass casualties. They had spent hours studying the room's layout, identifying the best locations for their explosive devices, and calculating the structural damage that would result from simultaneous detonations in the space directly beneath the school library. As the morning progressed, Harris and Klebold attended their classes as scheduled, maintaining the normal behavior that had allowed them to hide their plans for so long. Harris attended his bowling class, an irony that would later become symbolic when Michael Moore titled his documentary about school violence, Bowling for Columbine. Klebold attended his creative writing class, where he had spent months producing dark stories and poetry that his teacher found concerning but not alarming enough to report to administrators. Their teachers would later describe both students as behaving normally on the morning of April 20th, participating in class discussions, completing assignments, and showing no signs of the violence they were planning. This ability to compartmentalize, to maintain normal social facades while preparing for mass murder, demonstrates the sophisticated planning and emotional control that went into the attack. These weren't impulsive teenagers acting out in a moment of rage. They were calculated killers executing a long-term plan. As 11 a.m. approached, both Harris and Klebold began making their final preparations. They had arranged to leave their morning classes early, using various excuses to avoid raising suspicion. Harris told his teacher he needed to return a book to the library. Klebold claimed he had an appointment with his counselor. These small lies, delivered with the same casual confidence they had used to hide their preparations for months, allowed them to position themselves for the attack without alerting anyone to their true intentions. Around 11:10 a.m., Harris and Klebold retrieved the 2 large propane bombs from their cars and carried them into the school cafeteria. The bombs, each weighing approximately 20 pounds and containing enough explosive material to level the entire dining area, were hidden in duffel bags and positioned strategically among the lunch tables. They set the timers for 11:17 a.m. and then calmly walked out of the cafeteria, leaving behind devices that were supposed to transform their high school into a crater and their classmates into casualties at 11:15 a.m. Nearly 500 students were sitting in the cafeteria, eating lunch and engaging in the typical social interactions of high school life. Rachel Scott was outside with friends, enjoying the beautiful weather. Dave Sanders was in his office, probably grading papers or preparing for his next class. Cassie Bernal was in the library above the cafeteria, studying or working on homework. None of them knew that they had less than 2 minutes to live, assuming Harris and Klebold's bombs worked as intended. 11:17 a.m. came and went. The bombs didn't explode. In the cafeteria, students continued eating and chatting, completely unaware of the explosive devices hidden among them. In the parking lot, Harris and Klebold waited for the earth-shattering blast that would signal the beginning of their transformation from unknown teenagers into the most infamous killers in American history. When the explosion didn't come, their carefully planned attack suddenly became an improvisation. Later investigation would reveal that the bombs failed because of amateur construction errors in the timing devices. Harris and Klebold had spent months learning to build explosive devices from internet instructions and library books, but they lacked the technical expertise to create reliably functioning bombs. The propane tanks contained enough explosive material to kill hundreds of people, but the detonation mechanisms failed to work as designed. This technical failure saved hundreds of lives but also forced the attackers to implement what they had considered their backup plan, a direct assault with firearms at 11:19 a.m. After waiting 2 minutes for explosions that never came, Harris and Klebold decided to begin shooting. They had practiced this scenario during their planning sessions, but it was never supposed to be their primary method of attack. The shooting was intended to target survivors fleeing the bombed cafeteria, not to be the main event itself. This shift from their original plan would have profound implications for how the attack unfolded and how it would be remembered and studied in the years that followed. The first shots were fired at 11:19 a.m. in the school parking lot, targeting students who were eating lunch outside on the grass. Rachel Scott, a 17-year-old who loved photography and wanted to inspire people through her art, was among the first casualties. Richard Castaldo, who was eating lunch with Rachel, was wounded but survived. These initial shots shattered the peaceful spring morning and marked the beginning of an attack that would last 47 minutes and claim 13 lives inside the school. The first gunshots were met with confusion rather than immediate recognition of danger. Many students and teachers thought they were hearing construction noise, firecrackers, or perhaps a senior prank. The idea that their school was under attack was so far outside their experience that their minds searched for more mundane explanations for the sounds they were hearing. This initial confusion would cost precious seconds that could have been used for evacuation or securing classrooms. After the initial shooting in the parking lot, Harris and Klebold moved toward the school's west entrance, continuing to fire at students and staff they encountered. Their movements appeared random to witnesses, but they were actually following a rough plan they had developed for this contingency. They intended to move through the school systematically, targeting areas where they expected to find the most people, while also attempting to detonate their failed bombs and set off additional explosive devices they had planted throughout the building. Dave Sanders, a 47-year-old business teacher and girls basketball coach, was among the first adults to recognize that the school was under attack. Sanders had spent 25 years at Columbine, and his immediate instinct was to protect his students. He began running through the hallways, warning everyone he encountered to take shelter and call for help. His quick thinking and decisive action undoubtedly saved lives, though it would ultimately cost him his own. The school's initial response was hampered by confusion about what was actually happening. Early PA announcements told students to stay in their classrooms due to an incident in the parking lot, but didn't convey the severity of the threat or provide clear instructions for lockdown procedures. This lack of clear communication contributed to the chaos and may have prevented some students and teachers from taking appropriate protective measures. For the students inside Columbine, the transition from normal school day to life-threatening crisis happened with shocking suddenness. Many would later describe a surreal quality to those first few minutes, as their minds struggled to process what was happening. Some students heard gunshots and immediately understood the danger, while others continued with their normal activities even as chaos erupted around them. This varied response illustrates the difficulty of recognizing and responding to unprecedented threats. The first 911 call reporting shots fired at Columbine High School was received at 11:19 a.m., the same minute Harris and Klebold began shooting. However, the initial law enforcement response was cautious and methodical, following protocols designed for more typical emergency situations. Officers weren't immediately sure what they were dealing with, and their training emphasized establishing perimeters and waiting for SWAT teams rather than immediately entering the building to confront active shooters. By 11:25 a.m., 6 minutes into the attack, Harris and Klebold had entered the school building and were moving through the hallways, firing randomly at students and staff they encountered. They appeared to be heading toward the cafeteria, possibly hoping to manually detonate their failed bombs, but they were also opportunistically targeting anyone they found along the way. Their behavior suggested a combination of following their original plan while also improvising based on immediate opportunities for violence, as emergency responders began arriving at the school. The full scope of the crisis was still unclear. Initial reports suggested multiple shooters in different locations, possible hostage situations, and additional explosive devices throughout the building. This uncertainty, combined with concerns about officer safety and the possibility of walking into traps, influenced the tactical response and contributed to what would later be criticized as an overly cautious approach to ending the threat. At 11:29 a.m., 10 minutes after the shooting began, Harris and Klebold entered the school library where 52 people, mostly students, had taken shelter under tables and desks. What happened during the next 7 minutes would become the deadliest phase of the entire attack and would create trauma that survivors would carry for the rest of their lives. The improvised massacre that began when 2 bombs failed to explode was about to reach its most horrific phase. In the Columbine Library, 52 people were about to face the reality that their normal Tuesday morning had become a fight for survival, and that the 2 classmates they thought they knew were capable of unimaginable violence. The next 7 minutes would define how America thinks about school violence, change how we protect our children, and create a template for tragedy that would be repeated in schools across the nation for decades to come. 47 minutes. That's how long it took for Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold to transform from anonymous high school seniors into 2 of the most infamous killers in American history. 47 minutes to shatter the illusion of safety that had protected American schools for generations. 47 minutes to create a template for violence that would be studied, copied, and tragically repeated for decades to come. What happened during those 47 minutes isn't just the story of one terrible day in Littleton, Colorado. It's the story of how America lost its innocence and learned to fear its own children. But before we can understand the impact of those 47 minutes, we need to see them not as abstract violence or statistics, but as individual moments when real people made choices that revealed both the worst and best of human nature. We need to see Dave Sanders running through hallways to warn students, knowing he was risking his own life. We need to see teenagers shielding their friends with their own bodies. We need to see ordinary people facing extraordinary evil and choosing courage over self-preservation. The first shot, fired at 11:19 a.m., shattered more than the spring morning quiet at Columbine High School. It shattered the assumption that schools were sanctuaries, that teenagers were safe among their peers, that violence was something that happened to other people in other places. Rachel Scott was sitting on the grass with her friend Richard Castaldo, probably talking about typical teenage concerns, weekend plans, upcoming tests, maybe even prom, which had happened just 3 days earlier. Rachel Joy Scott was 17 years old, a junior who loved photography, drama, and writing. She kept journals filled with thoughts about inspiring others and making a positive difference in the world. Her friends described her as someone who stood up for outcasts, who was kind to students others ignored, who genuinely believed she could change the world through small acts of compassion. She had no way of knowing that Eric Harris had spotted her from across the parking lot and had decided she would be his first victim. The first bullet struck Rachel in the leg and back, knocking her to the ground but not immediately killing her. Richard Castaldo, sitting next to her, was hit in the spine and paralyzed. In the initial confusion, some students thought they were witnessing a senior prank or perhaps a movie being filmed on campus. The idea that their classmates were actually shooting at them was so far outside their experience that their minds searched for alternative explanations for what they were seeing. Daniel Rohrbar, a 15-year-old freshman, was climbing the exterior stairs to the west entrance when he heard the gunshots. Instead of running away, his first instinct was to look back and see what was happening. That moment of curiosity, that split second of teenage invincibility thinking this couldn't be real, cost him his life. Sean Graves and Lance Kirkland, two other students on the stairs, were wounded but survived those first chaotic minutes. Harris and Klebold were working their way toward the school building, firing at anyone they saw. Their movements weren't random. They were following a rough plan they had developed for this contingency, moving systematically toward areas where they expected to find the most targets. The exterior shooting lasted only a few minutes, but in that time they had already begun the process of transforming a normal school day into a national tragedy inside Columbine High School. The initial reaction to the gunshots outside was confusion rather than immediate recognition of danger. In classrooms throughout the building, teachers were trying to determine whether the sounds they were hearing were construction noise, firecrackers, or something more serious. Students were looking out windows, asking questions, and generally treating the situation as an interesting interruption rather than a life-threatening emergency. Dave Sanders was different. A 47-year-old business teacher and coach who had spent 25 years at Columbine. Sanders had developed an intuitive understanding of what normal school sounds were and what they weren't. When he heard sustained gunfire outside, he didn't hesitate or second-guess himself. He immediately understood that his school was under attack, and his first instinct was to protect his students. David Arthur Sanders was exactly the kind of teacher every parent hopes their child will encounter. He coached the girls' basketball team to state championships, mentored struggling students, and was known for staying after hours to help anyone who needed academic or personal guidance. He was a grandfather who loved fishing and spending time with his family, a man who had dedicated his life to education and to young people. On April 20th, that dedication would cost him everything. Sanders began running through the school hallways, bursting into classrooms and shouting warnings, "Get down! There's a kid with a gun." His quick thinking and decisive action undoubtedly saved dozens of lives, as teachers began locking classroom doors, turning off lights, and moving students away from windows. But his heroic actions also made him a target as Harris and Klebold entered the building meanwhile. In the cafeteria, where nearly 500 students were eating lunch, the two 20-pound propane bombs that were supposed to have exploded at 11:17 a.m. sat silent among the lunch tables. Students continued eating and chatting, completely unaware that they were sitting within feet of devices designed to kill them all. Kitchen workers noticed the suspicious duffel bags but assumed they belonged to students and didn't. Investigate further, the failure of these bombs cannot be overstated in its importance to the final casualty count at Columbine. If Harris and Klebold had successfully constructed their explosive devices, the death toll would have been in the hundreds rather than the teens. The cafeteria would have been destroyed, the library above would have collapsed, and the attack would have claimed more lives than the Oklahoma City bombing. Their technical incompetence, ironically, prevented one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in American history. After leaving the library, Harris and Klebold wandered the school hallways for nearly 30 more minutes, occasionally firing shots at nothing in particular, attempting to detonate additional explosive devices, and apparently unsure about what to do next. Their original plan had called for the attack to end with the bombing of the cafeteria, but with their bombs having failed, they seemed to be improvising without clear objectives. They returned to the cafeteria where their propane bombs sat unexploded among the abandoned lunch tables. They fired several shots at the devices, apparently hoping to trigger the explosions manually, but succeeded only in creating small fires that were quickly extinguished by the building sprinkler system. They also threw pipe bombs and other small explosive devices throughout the school, but most of these failed to cause significant damage or casualties. The improvised nature of the final 30 minutes of the attack demonstrates how much Harris and Klebold had been counting on their bombs to be the primary instrument of mass destruction. Without the spectacular explosions they had planned, they seemed almost aimless, randomly firing shots and setting off small devices but no longer working toward any coherent goal other than extending their moment of infamy for as long as possible. While Harris and Klebold wandered the hallways, Dave Sanders was bleeding to death in a science classroom surrounded by students who were desperately trying to save his life. For over 2 hours, these teenagers applied pressure to his wounds, talked to him to keep him conscious, and called 911 repeatedly begging for medical assistance. Sanders showed them pictures of his family, told them he was proud of them, and tried to keep their spirits up even as he was dying. "Tell my girls I love them," Sanders whispered to the students caring for him, referring to his daughters. These teenagers, some of whom had never dealt with anything more serious than a scraped knee, were now watching a beloved teacher die slowly while emergency medical personnel remained outside the building, unable or unwilling to risk entering while the attack was still ongoing. The law enforcement response to Columbine would later become a subject of intense controversy and criticism. Officers from multiple agencies, Littleton Police, Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, and eventually SWAT teams, surrounded the building and established perimeters. But they didn't immediately enter to confront the attackers or rescue the wounded. Their training and protocols emphasized containing the threat and protecting officer safety rather than quickly neutralizing active shooters. This cautious approach, which might have been appropriate for a hostage situation or barricaded suspect, proved tragically inadequate for dealing with active shooters who were moving through the building killing people. While officers waited outside for better intelligence and tactical support, Harris and Klebold continued their attack unimpeded, and Dave Sanders bled to death waiting for medical help that never arrived in time. The radio communications from that day reveal confusion about the number of attackers, their locations, and their intentions. Reports suggested multiple gunmen in different parts of the building, possible hostage situations, and additional bombs that might explode at any moment. This uncertainty, combined with concerns about officer safety and the possibility of walking into traps, influenced the decision to maintain perimeter positions rather than immediately entering the building at 12:05 p.m. 46 minutes into their attack, Harris and Klebold returned to the library where they had committed their worst atrocities. By this point, all of the survivors had either escaped or been evacuated by police, leaving the room empty except for the bodies of the 10 people who had died during the earlier assault. The attackers seemed drawn back to this space where they had experienced their moment of ultimate power and control, for reasons that will never be fully understood. Harris and Klebold decided to end their lives in the library where they had taken so many others. Perhaps they realized that their moment of infamy was coming to an end, that they would soon be captured or killed by law enforcement. Perhaps they had accomplished what they set out to do and saw suicide as the final act in their performance. Or perhaps they simply ran out of ideas for how to continue their improvised massacre at 12:08 p.m., exactly 49 minutes after they had fired their first shots. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold committed suicide in the Columbine High School library. Harris shot himself in the mouth with a shotgun. Klebold shot himself in the left temple with his pistol. Their violent performance was over, but the trauma they had created would last for generations. The silence that followed their deaths was not peace. It was the silence of a shattered community trying to comprehend an incomprehensible act. Outside the school, parents were still waiting desperately for word about their children. Emergency responders were still afraid to enter the building, not knowing that the threat had ended. And across America, people were watching news coverage of something that had never happened before, something that would change how we think about schools, safety, and childhood forever. While Harris and Klebold's attack lasted 49 minutes, the agony for families lasted much longer. Parents had been gathering at Leawood Elementary School since the first news reports, desperately trying to get information about their children's safety. Some had received phone calls or text messages from their kids, but many others were facing hours of uncertainty about whether their children were alive or dead as students were evacuated from Columbine throughout the afternoon. Scenes played out at the elementary school that captured both the relief of successful rescues and the devastating heartbreak of ultimate loss. Parents ran toward their children with tears of joy, hugging them with desperate gratitude and promising never to let them go. Other parents waited longer and longer as the crowd of reunited families thinned, gradually realizing that their children might not be coming home. Tom and Sue Klebold were among the parents waiting at the elementary school, not knowing that their son Dylan was one of the attackers. For hours, they experienced the same fear and hope as all the other parents, calling his cell phone repeatedly, asking other students if they had seen him, praying that he was safe. The revelation that Dylan was one of the killers would come later, adding a completely different type of devastation to their already unbearable grief as news of the attack spread. Columbine High School became the center of a media circus that would define how school shootings were covered for decades to come. Television crews, newspaper reporters, and magazine photographers descended on Littleton, turning a local tragedy into a national spectacle. The images they captured: students running from the school with their hands up, parents desperately searching for their children, SWAT teams surrounding the building, became iconic symbols of a new type of American tragedy. The initial media coverage of Columbine established many of the myths that persist about school shootings to this day. Reports describe Harris and Klebold as members of the trenchcoat mafia seeking revenge against jocks who had bullied them. Stories emerged about them asking victims if they believed in God before killing them. Claims were made about the influence of violent video games, dark music, and Gothic culture on their behavior. Almost all of these early reports were wrong, but they became the accepted narrative about what had happened at Columbine. The myth of the bullied outcasts gaining revenge against their tormentors was more compelling and easier to understand than the complex reality of a psychopath manipulating a depressed teenager into participating in mass murder. The media needed simple explanations for incomprehensible acts. So they created a story that made sense even though it wasn't true. By the end of April 20th, 1999, 13 people were dead, 21 others were wounded, and a nation was forced to confront the reality that schools were no longer safe sanctuaries. But the real impact of Columbine wasn't just what happened that day. It was how that day changed everything that came after. The way we protect our children, the way we think about violence, the way we respond to threats, and the way we mourn our losses were all transformed by 49 minutes of improvised massacre in a suburban Colorado high school. The story of April 20th, 1999, is not just about Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. It's about Dave Sanders choosing to protect his students even when it cost him his life. It's about teenagers shielding their friends from bullets. It's about teachers barricading classroom doors and kitchen workers helping students escape. It's about a community coming together in the face of incomprehensible loss and choosing love over hatred, hope over despair, but it's also about how one day changed America forever, creating a new reality where children practice hiding from killers as routinely as they practice fire drills, where parents feel a spike of panic every time their child's school calls, and where the promise of safety that every generation tries to give the next was broken by two teenagers with guns and a plan to become infamous. The 49 minutes were over, but their consequences would last forever. Cassie Renee Bernal, 17, became the subject of one of the most enduring myths about Columbine, the story that she was asked if she believed in God and said yes before being killed. While investigators later determined this exchange didn't happen with Cassie, the story captured something important about how people wanted to remember the victims, as young people who maintained their faith and values even in the face of ultimate evil. Stephen Robert Kernow, 14, was the youngest victim, a freshman who loved airplanes and dreamed of becoming a pilot. Corey Tyler DePuta, 17, worked at a golf course and loved his pickup truck. Daniel Lee Rohrbaugh, 15, was known for his sense of humor and his kindness to younger students. Each victim had dreams, plans, and people who loved them. Each represented a future that would never be realized. Dave Sanders, 47, died as he had lived, protecting young people. His death was particularly devastating because it was so clearly preventable with a faster emergency response. His family later sued the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, arguing that their delayed tactics contributed to his death. The settlement they received could never restore their loss, but it did lead to changes in how law enforcement responds to active shooter situations. The 21 people who were wounded at Columbine faced a different kind of challenge, surviving with physical and psychological trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Richard Castaldo was paralyzed from the chest down. Patrick Ireland suffered traumatic brain injury that required years of rehabilitation. Many others dealt with less visible wounds, PTSD, depression, anxiety, and survivor's guilt that would require ongoing treatment. People ask me if I'm angry, one survivor said years later. I'm not angry at Dylan and Eric anymore. I'm angry at what they took from us, not just the people who died, but our sense of safety, our innocence, our belief that school was a place where you were protected. They stole our childhood, and there's no getting that back. The families of victims faced not just the normal grief of losing a loved one, but the additional trauma of losing them in such a public, violent way. Every anniversary brought renewed media attention. Every subsequent school shooting reopened their wounds. Their private grief became public property, examined and analyzed by reporters, researchers, and politicians who claimed to speak for them but often didn't understand their needs. The memorial services for the 13 victims revealed both the best of the Columbine community and the challenges they faced in processing such unprecedented loss. Churches overflowed with mourners. Community members who had never met the victims' families brought flowers, food, and offers of support. The outpouring of love was genuine and overwhelming, but it couldn't fill the holes left by the deaths or answer the question that haunted everyone. Why? Tom and Sue Klebold and Wayne and Kathy Harris faced a uniquely isolating form of grief. They had lost their children too, but their children were the perpetrators rather than the victims. They received death threats rather than sympathy cards. They were blamed for their sons' actions and subjected to intense scrutiny of their parenting, their values, and their failures to recognize the warning signs. "I loved my son," Sue Klebold would later write, "but I failed to recognize how much pain he was in, and I failed to see that he was capable of hurting others. Those failures will haunt me for the rest of my life." Every parent of a victim at Columbine has lost a child. I lost mine too, but I also lost the illusion that I knew who my child really was. Studies conducted years after Columbine found elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD throughout the Littleton community. Students who weren't even at school that day experienced trauma from watching news coverage and fearing for friends and siblings. Teachers struggled with hypervigilance and difficulty trusting their students. Parents developed anxiety about sending their children to school. The ripple effects extended far beyond those directly involved in the shooting. The story of Columbine doesn't end with the 49 minutes of violence that occurred on April 20th, 1999. It doesn't even end with the immediate aftermath, the policy changes, or the cultural transformation that followed. The story of Columbine is still being written every day in every American school. Every time a student practices hiding from killers. Every time a parent feels anxious about their child's safety. Every time a community mourns new victims of school violence. Harris and Klebold succeeded in ways they never could have imagined. They didn't just kill 13 people. They killed American childhood's assumption of safety. They didn't just attack one school. They transformed every school in the country. They didn't just seek personal notoriety. They created a template for infamy that continues to inspire troubled individuals, seeking their own moment of twisted fame. But the story of Columbine is also about resilience, courage, and the refusal to be defined by violence. It's about Dave Sanders choosing to protect his students even when it cost him his life. It's about teenagers shielding their friends from bullets. It's about communities coming together in the face of incomprehensible loss and choosing love over hatred. Hope over despair, from Rachel's Challenge anti-bullying programs to improved emergency response protocols to increased mental health awareness, some good has emerged from the tragedy. Threat assessment programs have prevented numerous attacks. Student activism has achieved some policy victories. Communities have learned to support each other through trauma and loss. The students attending American schools today are not defined by the violence that changed their educational environment. They learn, they grow, they form friendships, they plan for futures, they fall in love, they discover their passions, all while navigating security measures that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Their resilience in the face of this reality is perhaps the most hopeful part of Columbine's legacy. The conversation about how to prevent school violence continues, with new generations of leaders bringing fresh perspectives to old problems. Student activists who grew up with lockdown drills are demanding that adults do more to protect them. Researchers continue studying the causes and prevention of mass violence. Communities continue searching for the balance between security and educational mission. We are not going to accept this as normal, declares a teenage activist. Just because this has been happening for 25 years doesn't mean it has to keep happening for the next 25. We can do better. We have to do better. The adults failed our generation on this issue, but we are not going to fail the next one. The ultimate legacy of Columbine will be determined by what we do next. Will we continue accepting school violence as an inevitable part of American life? Or will we finally find the political will to implement the comprehensive reforms that research suggests could prevent future tragedies? Will we keep treating symptoms while ignoring causes? Or will we address the underlying factors that create school shooters? Every morning, millions of American children walk into schools designed around the assumption that they might be attacked by their classmates. Every morning, their parents send them off with kisses and hopes and the knowledge that perfect safety is an illusion they can no longer maintain. Every morning, teachers prepare to educate and inspire while also being ready to protect and defend. This is Columbine's legacy, not just the 13 people who died on April 20th, 1999, but the millions of lives that have been shaped by that violence ever since. The students who have grown up never knowing school without security measures. The parents who live with anxiety about their children's safety. The teachers who balance education with emergency preparedness. The communities that have had to learn how to heal from incomprehensible lost 25 years after Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold walked into their high school with guns and bombs. We are still living with the consequences of their actions. We are still trying to understand how to prevent similar tragedies. We are still debating the same policy questions. We are still sending children to schools designed around the fear they created. The story of Columbine is not finished. It continues every day in every American school, and it will continue until we find the wisdom, courage, and political will to write a different ending. The question is not whether we remember the 13 people who died on April 20th, 1999. We will always remember them. The question is what we do with that memory to ensure that no other community has to join the tragic fraternity that Columbine began. The 49 minutes ended 25 years ago. The consequences continue today. The choice about what happens next is ours.